Hello everyone, and welcome to our second lecture on depressants and inhalants. So last time we were talking about depressants. And of course one of the first things we talked about was what depressants are. And depressants, as we defined it, are drugs that decrease the excitability of the nervous system, that lower overall neural activity. And they tend to do this in a fairly global sense. We also talked about how depressants tend to work on the neurotransmitter GABA and enhance GABA's activity or enhance its effects or mimic GABA. And so that's going to really decrease the level of activity in the nervous system because as a neurotransmitter, GABA is so widespread throughout the brain. It's second only to glutamate in terms of how frequently those synapses use GABA. So that's what depressants are. And of course, we talked about several classes of depressant drugs. And we talked about the history of depressants. And the history mainly centers around synthetic depressants. There are a couple of naturally occurring ones. We'll talk about one today. There's also alcohol, which obviously is a big depressant, a big part of our society. But we're actually going to defer our discussion of alcohol for a couple of weeks and talk about it later. It's such an important depressant, it gets a whole week. But we talked about the history of depressants and how depressants were synthesized starting in the late early 1800s. And really the progress made in the development of depressants, the lessening of side effects, the increase in efficacy, the widening of therapeutic range. So that's really the history of depressants is how developers have come up with several new kinds of depressants that have the same effects without the negatives, or at least fewer negatives. And we talked about the effects of depressants behaviorally. So substances that, for example, help you go to sleep or decrease motor activity, especially for things like anticonvulsants, drugs that help alleviate the symptoms of epilepsy. There are also anti-anxiety drugs. So these are all effects that can be alleviated. These are all phenomena that can be alleviated through the use of depressant drugs, the responsible use, of course. There are also negative effects, things like tolerance, things like dependence. So those can happen as well. But all depressants are pretty similar in terms of those effects, in terms of the risk for dependence. Some a little more than others, but they're fairly unified in that sense. And then today we'll talk about inhalants. And inhalants are a little unusual because they're defined by their method of administration, how they get into the body. But they tend to have depressant-like effects, and so that's why we're including them in this unit. So in particular today, what we'll look at is the effects of GHB. And we'll talk about how GHB is actually a naturally occurring substance in the body. So it is one of those substances that we do actually synthesize. Drugs based on GHB and GHB itself are synthetic, but they also occur naturally in small quantities in the body. We'll also talk about how depressants have an effect on memory and why depressants seem to interfere with formation of memory. Many depressants, especially taken in large doses, interfere with the person's ability to recollect events while they were under the influence of the depressant. So we'll talk about that as well and why that happens. And again, we'll talk about inhalants. So we'll spend the last part of this unit on inhalants, what they are, what they do. Okay, first let's go into last week's discussion questions. So we had 3 questions for last week. And one was about drug use in dangerous professions. So we know that during World War II that both sides were given amphetamines as a means of primarily increasing their alertness, but it turns out it also elevated their mood. And so what are the ethical implications of doing that? How should we approach that as a society? And of course, one big issue that was brought up was long-term versus short-term consequences. In the short term, maybe it does increase the probability that someone will save their own life or save the life of someone else. But in the short term, or in the long term, of course, we know that amphetamine use has some negative consequences. not the least of which is dependence. And so how do we weigh those two possible outcomes? The short-term enhancement of someone's abilities with the long-term negative effects on their health. How do we weigh those two things against each other? And of course, the rights of the individual was a common topic. So do we have the right as an organization to impose drug use on a group of employees or members of the organization? And the issue was brought up that no, we don't have the right to impose drug use, but perhaps with informed consent, people could opt into it if they wanted to do it. There was also another individual concern dealing with different reactions. And of course, that can vary from person to person. Someone may have a certain dosage that's appropriate for them, but that dosage may be too much or too little for the next person. And so, especially dealing with a large organization, like a military organization, how do you deal with differences in reaction to a drug? And of course, if someone's taking it for a while, their reaction will be different due to tolerance. So, how does an organization deal with individual differences like that? Not just the rights of the individual, but how do we approach differences in response to the drug across individuals? The next topic was cognitive enhancers. What if you could take a pill that made you smarter in some sense? The first issue that was brought up was defining a cognitive enhancer. So if a person with ADD takes Adderall, for example, is that a cognitive enhancement, or is that just alleviating a condition that makes them like the average person? And for this topic, we're mainly talking about what if an average person could take a substance that increased their abilities above those of the average individual. And the big concern here is one of fairness. So I believe there was an example of what about people taking standardized tests? What if people are taking one of these cognitive enhancers? Do we need to screen for drug use? Do we need to regulate it in some way? Because that can drastically affect the outcome of someone's life if they're cognitively enhanced when they're doing their job or taking a test of some sort. Also, as is the case with a lot of drugs, these things can be expensive. Cognitive enhancers don't exist yet, but any new drug that comes to the market tends to be fairly expensive, and sometimes some drugs will even remain expensive. So what if only the wealthy can afford such a cognitive enhancer? Is that fair? Do we need to regulate it to combat that effect? The risk is that if only the wealthy are using cognitive enhancers, now not only is there an income gap, there's a biological gap in terms of ability. And so that can exacerbate itself, right? What if these cognitive enhancers allow that person to make even more money? And now you've suddenly got these two growingly different groups within society. So how do we address that issue of fairness? Also, what would the side effects be? And if you had such a large portion of the population voluntarily taking a drug, you have to be really careful about what the side effects are. It's not a small handful of people. It's a really large segment of society, potentially. And what if there are side effects we don't anticipate? Do we need to worry about regulating these sort of optional drugs, with the concern being that there could be really severe long-term side effects? The third question was about cocaine, and really about the penalties associated with cocaine. And people were pretty split. It was pretty evenly mixed in terms of whether people thought there should be more severe or less severe penalties for cocaine. But the important part, and there's no clear answer to that, the important part is to think about the consequences. So people that favor less severe penalties, the concern is, what if that increases cocaine usage? We've already seen in a previous lecture that the use of a drug is often correlated with the public perception of its safety rather than its pure availability. But the legal penalties involved may be a player there as well. We know legalization has a big impact on drug use statistics, but small changes in the legal penalty, given that it is illegal, it's not clear how big an effect those have. On the other side, making penalties more severe. The concern there is that if the penalty is very severe for admitting drug use or being caught using drugs, will that decrease the willingness of people to go seek help? If they're dependent on cocaine, Will they keep on using cocaine but never seek treatment for addiction, for fear of being penalized? So there was another important issue brought up in discussion, and that is, what if the person is already addicted? Um, and that is the issue of treatment. So this was mainly brought up in the context of uh, maybe seeking treatment within the prison system. If you're in prison for cocaine use, what is the obligation to provide drug treatment programs to individuals? Uh, but the bigger concern, perhaps, is what if you're already addicted and you continue to use cocaine and then you don't have any options for treatment? You can't afford it, or it's not available to you for some reason. And so the idea of recidivism, continually uh, using drugs illegally. And there's a question there of, um, should the penalties get more severe if we know the person already has trouble and they don't have the ability to seek help? Um, so that is a big issue with penalties on cocaine as well, that the penalties for crime tend to escalate with repeated offenses. Uh, and one can make the argument that that provides an incentive to get off of cocaine. Uh, but at the same time, we know that addictions can be compulsive behaviors, and so there's an ethical issue there. How do we adjust penalties for drug use when a person we know already has less control over their behavior than someone who's never initiated drug use in the first place? So as always, good discussions this week. So for this coming week, we'll keep the same discussion groups. I will rotate them at the end of the week. I'll send an announcement out about that, but keep up the good work. Okay, so getting back to depressants, the first one I'll talk about is gamma hydroxybutyric acid, also known as GHB. It was first synthesized in the 1870s, but its psychological effects weren't really appreciated then. It was more of a chemical experiment. But it was started to be studied in the 1960s uh, because it binds to the GABA B receptor, the metabotropic GABA receptor that we mentioned last time. And so lots of drugs, and this is true for drugs as well as toxins, are used in neuroscience research because they affect a particular receptor or class of receptors. And so you can see how a neuron functions, if it does, once a particular kind of receptor, a particular kind of ion channel has been knocked out or has been enhanced. So in the 1960s, GHB was starting to be studied um, because of its effect on neurons. GHB, as I said at the beginning of last session, the depressants we'll talk about for the most part are synthetic. But GHB actually occurs naturally. Our bodies produce it in small quantities. Now, for the drug, it's synthesized, but of course, chemically they're identical. The drug produced synthetically is the same as the substance that's produced by our bodies. It just happens that it's produced in larger quantities, and so it's not efficient to try and harvest it from a natural source. But anyway, GHB is a depressant that does occur naturally. So what is GHB used for? Well, it has effects that are similar to alcohol, so we can sort of expect that it would have similar behavioral effects, and if people are looking for alleviation of symptoms, it's possible they could turn to GHB. But legitimately, the only real treatment currently in the U.S. is for narcolepsy, which is a sleeping disorder. And it may seem counterintuitive that a disorder where you fall asleep frequently, and when falling asleep isn't under your control, that those symptoms would be alleviated by GHB, which is a depressant, but nevertheless, it seems to help. So that is the only currently recognized use in the U.S. of GHB. It's, of course, more famously used as a date rape drug like Rohypnol, colloquially known as rupees. So this is a substance that lowers inhibitions, also in sufficient quantities, sedates the person, makes them unable to resist an attacker, but also disrupts memory of the attack. Now, this is a common problem. It's true for alcohol as well. It's true for many depressants, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So because GHB is dangerous in certain circumstances and used illegally, but also as this sort of one legitimate use, the narcolepsy preparation, even though it's still GHB, is listed on Schedule 3, whereas GHB just by itself, not in the solution used to treat narcolepsy, is listed on Schedule 1. So you have this interesting dichotomy in how GHB is treated. And that will bear on our discussion this week as well. So switching gears a little bit, why do depressants disrupt memory? So it's a very common symptom, especially for high doses of depressants. So talking about memory, memory is the result of learning. So whenever you're talking about the psychology of memory, you can't talk about memory without talking about learning. Learning is the process, and then memory is the product. So a memory is a set of information that can be recalled. And it comes in a lot of forms. I'm not going to belabor the different kinds of memory that exist. That's a topic that's usually covered in Psych 101 or biopsychology. So we're not going to worry about the different forms, but the form that matters for our purposes today is what's called long-term memory. And of course, memories are stored in the brain. So information, especially associations between different kinds of information or different events, is stored in the brain, eventually using long-term memory. So at first, everything is what's called working or short-term memory, and then after a while, that information is repeated, or if we're trying to remember it, if we're trying to store the information for later, it gets put into long-term memory. And so on the right here, we see a famous example of memory, a certain kind of memory, and this is Pavlov and Pavlov's dog. And what Pavlov did was train a dog to associate the ringing of a bell with getting food. And this is what's called classical conditioning. Again, we're not going to go into the details, but the idea is the dog learned to associate a bell ringing with the idea that food was coming soon, and so it would start to salivate. But this is an association the dog didn't have before. Didn't have any reason to, but it learned that first comes the bell, then comes food. And so that was laid down somewhere in its brain. And our brains are no different. We still store memories in our neurons. So this brings up the idea of what's called Hebbian learning. Hebbian is named after Donald Hebb, who was a famous neuroscientist. But this idea is usually summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. Which means that if the presynaptic neuron fires, and the postsynaptic one fires as a result, that the more often those have happened together, the stronger that association becomes. And the more easily the postsynaptic neuron will fire when the presynaptic one does. We recall from our unit on drugs in the brain that neurons sort of add together all the impulses that are coming in from presynaptic neurons. And so if the neuron reaches a certain threshold, it'll fire. And what Hebbian learning says is, well, for presynaptic neurons that are associated with the postsynaptic one firing, the postsynaptic neuron will actually become more sensitive to those presynaptic neurons. It'll fire more easily. And it's thought that's what underlies memory. And specifically, it's thought that a process called long-term potentiation, which usually is called LTP for short, is what underlies memory. So the idea here again is that when a neuron that responds to a stimulus fires, if the neuron that's responsible for the response, in a simple case, also fires, then those become associated. And the responding neuron, the second neuron, will fire more easily as it learns to associate responding with a particular stimulus as represented by that first neuron. So here we have an example of LTP. Again, not going to go into the details neurologically, but the idea is that memory, the formation of memory in the brain, depends on activity in the brain, depends on patterns of activity. So if you use depressants to decrease the level of activity in the brain, it's going to be less likely that those neurons fire together. So you no longer have that correlation between one neuron and the other. You're not going to get those synapses strengthened. That postsynaptic neuron has no reason to become sensitive to the presynaptic one because they're not firing together anymore. You've decreased the level of activity in the nervous system. And so you don't get that memory formation. You don't get that association between neuron 1 and neuron 2. And so it's thought that's why depressants disrupt memories. They decrease the activity level in the brain, so they decrease the likelihood that neurons will fire together and form memories, form associations between neurons. Okay, so moving on to the final class of depressants we'll consider, and those are inhalants. And these are an unusual group because inhalants are, as the name implies, defined by their method of administration, that is, how they get into the body, rather than the effects they have. Inhalants are actually very structurally different from one another. So chemically, they don't have much in common. They generally have depressant effects, which is why they're grouped with the depressants for our purposes. But they're grouped together mainly because they're all inhaled. They're all taken the same way, which is a little unusual, again, because imagine if we classified the opioids and cocaine all in one group because they're sometimes injected. So that wouldn't make much sense. It also wouldn't make much sense to put alcohol in the same category as anything else just because it happens to be consumed orally. So psychotherapeutic drugs, amphetamines, and alcohol, even though they're all ingested, don't belong to the same group. But the inhalants are, so we'll go with it. One of the earliest inhalants were the gaseous anesthetics. Now, these became more commonly used in the 1800s. They were technically synthesized in the late 1700s, but they became more commonly used in the 1800s as anesthetics, as agents that would induce unconsciousness especially for surgery. One of the earliest and most famous is nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas. You probably encountered it at the dentist, or if you've had surgery, oftentimes you'll get laughing gas first and then get a more potent, long-lasting anesthetic. Here on the right, I have a diagram. Here, what nitrous oxide means, it's the one in the middle, N2O. The one on the left, NO, is nitric oxide, and is actually produced naturally by your body and is used commonly in synaptic transmission. Nitrous oxide, the one in the middle, has 2 nitrogens, 1 oxygen. And then the one on the right is nitrogen dioxide, which is not good for you. So these small changes, adding a nitrogen, having an oxygen instead of a nitrogen, these make big differences. Anyway, so nitrous oxide was one of the first gaseous anesthetics, but it takes a lot to induce unconsciousness, and that's dangerous. And so it was not a very effective anesthetic for long surgeries. You also have diethyl ether, which is often just referred to as ether. And this was another common anesthetic. But again, it's very difficult to get the amount right, which is to say that anesthetics have a very narrow therapeutic range. That's why you have a whole class of doctors called anesthesiologists. A lot of factors come into consideration regarding the individual, regarding the anesthetic being used, and we still don't have a great take on why anesthetics have the effect they do. They're one of the most mysterious classes of drugs in terms of how they have their effects. We just know that they tend to put people to sleep. But they can be very dangerous, and so that's why we have specialists that work with anesthetics. After that came the nitrites, not the nitrates, the nitrites. We're not going to get into the chemical difference, but some of the most famous are amyl nitrite and nitroglycerin, which is a famous explosive, but also it's famous for treating heart conditions. So on TV, if you've ever seen someone go through chest pain and then try to find their pills and then put a pill under their tongue, usually that's a nitroglycerin. So what do these substances do? Well, they're vasodilators, which means they expand blood vessels in addition to their other depressant effects. Originally, this is used for chest pain like angina. Angina results from when coronary arteries aren't allowing enough blood through, and so this expands those arteries and lets more blood flow occur. So these nitrites were originally used for that. Uh, Later on, they became used recreationally. These tend to have very short-term effects, but they tend to induce a kind of euphoria, and they're also, by some people, thought to enhance sexual pleasure. So recreationally, that's the context they're used in. So that is the nitrites originally, and of course nitroglycerin is still prescribed, um, but they have both a legitimate medical use and a recreational use. Gaseous anesthetics aren't abused as often, mainly because it's more difficult to give it to administer, it's more dangerous, and it's more difficult to obtain. Gases aren't easy to transport, whereas liquids and pills are easy. Finally, we have the volatile solvents. And so here's a table from your book looking at the various inhalants and what the ingredients are. And this highlights the idea that the inhalants belong to a lot of different chemical groups. Structurally, they're very different, which is one of the reasons why it's sort of mysterious how they have the effects they do. Volatile solvents, of course, are products that aren't intended for any sort of use as a drug. The nitrites are, the anesthetics are, those are intended for human use. The volatile solvents are just household chemicals that can be inhaled. Oftentimes these are aerosol cans or things like gasoline, turpentine, paint thinner, uh, and drugs often have their pros and cons, but when it comes to the volatile solvents, this is really one of the most dangerous forms of drug use. Um, it tends to have long-term toxic effects on the brain, kills brain cells. Also, because these substances aren't manufactured for human use, they're not created in the proper dosages for human use. Um, so people are not only administering these drugs to themselves, they're also deciding on their own dosage, whereas taking a pill, for example, or pouring yourself a drink, um, these are sort of, it's commonly known, commonly manufactured in the appropriate dosage. Uh, the volatile solvents tend to recruit younger users. Because these solvents are depressants, they tend to have a lot of the same effects as alcohol. They're intoxicants. But if you're old enough, you can just buy alcohol. You don't have to buy these inhalants. Um, but if you're younger, if you cannot legally obtain alcohol, people often turn to volatile solvents because these products are so widely available. These are household chemicals, for example. Um, and so this tends to recruit a younger user, which is unfortunate because, again, they're dangerous substances. One of the most famous examples was in the 50s and the so-called epidemic of glue sniffing. That actually, the original story was from Pueblo in Colorado here. Um, so this was a story that got picked up in the media and exaggerated. And we had a discussion question about this a few weeks ago about how the media treats drug use. It might have done more harm than good because it was an isolated community, and now this widespread story, and now you wonder if people will start using this inhalant just because of the news story. Um, but that is perhaps the most famous example of inhalant use, even though it wasn't all that prevalent to begin with. Okay, so that will wrap up our unit on depressants and inhalants. Next time we'll look at psychotherapeutic drugs. So this will be next week. So how do we classify different psychological disorders? Different drugs are used for different disorders. So how do we match those up? What properties do the drugs have? What effects do they have on the brain and behavior? And what are the consequences of drug use of this sort? So we will talk about that next week, and I will see you then.